Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a story that really all hinges on a single document, an email that was unearthed, and it brings up a massive question. What did one of the world's biggest oil companies know about climate change, and, crucially, when did they know it?
You know, it's hard to believe, but this one email, which was brought to light by The Guardian, it has the power to reframe decades of public conversation around climate change. So how could it do that? Well, it does it by connecting a huge internal business decision directly to a global environmental crisis. And the story really kicks off way back in 1981. Now, to give you some context here, this is years before climate change was a major headline for most of us. It was actually 7 years before that landmark testimony to Congress by NASA scientist James Hansen. So remember this date, 1981. It's the anchor for everything else we're going to talk about.
And this quote right here, it gets to the absolute heart of the contradiction. See, on one hand, the source alleges that the company had this early internal knowledge of climate change. But on the other hand, it points to a multi-million-dollar, decades-long campaign to promote public doubt. That's the core tension we are exploring today. Okay, so let's get into the revelation itself. It all starts with that email and the man who wrote it.
The author's name was Lenny Bernstein. And look, he wasn't some outsider. He was a 30-year veteran, a chemical engineer for Exxon and Mobil. He was an in-house climate expert who even contributed to UN reports. So his perspective as a total insider, well, that's what makes this so incredibly significant.
And Bernstein's email reveals that this whole thing wasn't about some abstract academic study. No, this knowledge was triggered by a real-world, multi-billion-dollar business opportunity. The gigantic Natuna gas field over in Southeast Asia.
Now, the Natuna field, it was an absolutely immense reserve of natural gas. But, and this is a huge but, it had a massive catch. A staggering 70% of what was in that field wasn't usable gas at all. It was pure carbon dioxide. This presented a huge technical and, of course, environmental problem.
So, this created what's been called the Natuna dilemma. It wasn't just some scientific curiosity, you see. It was a business calculation, a very practical one. What on earth do you do with all of that CO2?
And Lenny Bernstein's own words here are pretty stark. He warned everyone that if the field was developed and all that CO2 was just vented into the atmosphere, which was standard practice at the time, it would become the planet's single largest point source of CO2. He even called it a potential carbon bomb.
So this was the internal process that Bernstein described. The company apparently didn't just ignore the climate implications. They assessed them. And this is the critical part. They began factoring the potential for future climate regulations right into their long-term business plans. And what this created were two parallel and completely conflicting narratives. Internally, you had this careful assessment of climate risk for their investments. But publicly, a very different story was allegedly being funded.
Right, so this brings us to that public campaign. The source material goes into detail about how the company acted externally during this exact same period.
According to research from Greenpeace, which was cited in the article, this was a sustained campaign. So what are we talking about here? Well, the claim is over $30 million spent across 27 years funding think tanks that promoted doubt about the scientific consensus on climate change. And this alleged strategy has led campaigners to draw a really powerful and, let's be honest, controversial parallel. They've compared it to the tobacco industry, which, as we know, for decades publicly questioned the scientific link between smoking and cancer. So, confronted with these allegations, how did the company officially respond? Let's take a look at their side of the story.
Their official response, which came from a spokesman, was basically that the science back then was just unsettled. The argument is that in 1981 there was no firm scientific consensus on climate change and there was a lot of division.
However, the historical timeline laid out in the source material really calls that defense into question. I mean, it shows U.S. government agencies were already studying the issue back in the 60s, and the National Academy of Sciences was reporting a consensus in the 70s. This was all before the Natuna Project was even on the table. So, why does a story from decades ago matter so much today? Well, because it raises these fundamental questions about corporate responsibility
and, long-term consequences.
Ethicist Alyssa Bernstein, who is quoted in the source, she argues the stakes here are actually even higher. She says that the comparison to tobacco kind of falls short because this isn't just about public health, it's about the health of the entire planet.
Maybe the most clarifying, if cynical take, comes from Lenny Bernstein himself in that original email. He suggests that for a corporation, environmental impacts are really only interesting insofar as they affect profits. It all comes down to a business calculation.
A report from the Union of Concerned Scientists introduces a really key concept here, a company's social license to operate. Now, this isn't some legal permit you can hold in your hand, it's about public trust. And their argument is that if you sow doubt about science, you put that essential trust at severe, severe risk.
And this all brings us to the big, lingering question at the very heart of this story. It's a question that sits right at the intersection of profit, science, and ethics. When a company's internal knowledge and its profit motives conflict with the well-being of the planet, what are its obligations to all of us? That's the question we'll leave you with.